Hello, everyone. My name is Choongwon Jeong, as presented, and it is my really great pleasure to be here presenting our study on the human population history, here focusing on the Eurasian steppe. So the Eurasian steppe, a vast grassland going along the Eurasian continent, here on the map marked by the yellow color, is not an easy place to live by the prehistoric hunter-gatherers. Before the introduction of domesticated animals, these hunter-gatherers used to and primarily occupied only the periphery of the steppe because in those regions they could only get the essential resources such as water and woods. And because of that, with the introduction of animals, but they finally got a measure to convert these human inedible vast amount of grass into almost everything they need to make a living in the steppe, including milk, meat, hide, wool, and bones. And also these animals provided traction and transportation so that they could cover a bigger area and extract more of the resources from the steppe. So from that, the steppe's human accessible productivity increased really a lot. So it is now very well known that pastoralism in the steppe developed over a few steps. First, the ruminant pastoralism was introduced by the Neolithic and early Bronze Age herders associated with the Yamnaya and then Afanasyevo cultures. And the Middle Bronze Age Shintashta and the Late Bronze Age Andronovo culture people introduced the horse pastoralism and chariots. And finally, the early Iron Age Scytho-Siberian people started riding horses and thereby completing the nomadic pastoralism as we know today. The center and the eastern Eurasian steppe, commonly called the Kazakh and the Mongolian steppe, actually harbor lots of different geographical features. And there were hunter-gatherers living in this diverse environment for tens of thousands of years already before the herders came in. So when the archaeogenetics people started investigating the region's genetic history, the many important questions remained unanswered or very unclear, including who were the hunter-gatherers living there before the Bronze Age herders came in, and with whom the first herders of the Afanasyevo cultures interacted, and what kinds of genetic legacy these first herders left. And how did the major horse herders, the Shintashta and Andronovo people, went beyond, across these steppes, including the far eastern Mongolian steppe? And what were the origins of the key groups like Iron Age Scytho-Siberians or the Xiongnu people, the first empire on the steppe? So we, myself representing here for multiple groups of collaborators, have studied these regions for about 10 years now, and we have made a good amount of contributions to answer some of those questions that I listed before. And today I'm going to make a very broad and brief summary of our works and others to give a brief overview of what happened in the steppe for the last several thousand years. Before jumping into those, I would like to introduce three sets of two-dimensional genetic maps that are very useful for you to trace the changes in the genetic profile of modern and ancient Eurasian individuals. So the first two-dimensional genetic map represents the two top axes of genetic variation called the principal components, or PCs, calculated using the method called principal component analysis, or PCA, out of the genome-wide genotype data of about 2,200 modern-day Eurasians and Native American individuals. Here on dot represents an individual's genetic profile, and two individuals being close on this plane suggests that they share a similar genetic profile and thereby share much of their genetic history. You can easily recognize these three triangular features separating Eastern Eurasians on the right upper and lower right corner, and Western Eurasians on the lower left corner, and Native Americans on the upper right corner. So Siberians and Central Asians scattered between the Western Eurasians and Eastern Eurasians, and populations around the Bering Strait runs between Native Americans and Eastern Eurasians. So second map is a recalculated pieces after removing the Native American individuals and keeping only about 2,000 Eurasian individuals. PC1 almost stays identical, but now PC2 separates the Eastern Eurasians along the north-south cline from Siberians to Southeast Asians. And in the same calculations, PC3 separates the Europeans and West Asians from, again, north-south directions. So these three maps are going to be pretty useful for you to trace these things. And from now on, I'm going to show a timeless overview of the dynamic changes in these Indo-Eurasian individuals' genetic profiles over space and time. So thinking of the region before the pastoralists coming in, there were already quite many different populations with different genetic profiles lived. For example, if we think of the Baikal region, there were once occupied by a group represented by these red dots, including the 24,000 years old Malta and 16,000 years old Afon-Tobagora. This one is frequently referred to as ancient North Eurasian because they lived in the north of the Eurasia. But these groups were broadly replaced in the Baikal region by groups with much higher genetic affinity with Eastern Eurasians. That means they are further to the right. So first by these green ones, the APS, or ancient Paleo-Siberians, represented by 14,000 years old Ust-Kiata in southern Siberia, and then by these magenta-colored diamonds, representing the early Holocene hunter-gatherers, early Neolithic hunter-gatherers of the Kitoi culture in West Baikal. Okay, and then if we look into the genetic profiles of the steppe, Kazakh and Mongolian steppes' northern boundaries, these hunter-gatherers fall, compared to those, these hunter-gatherers fall along this cline, running between the ANE populations and then APS and other populations here. So they fall on this cline, and what's very interesting is that if you compare this genetic map with the physical map over there, you can easily recognize that these groups seem to be clustered into a few distinct groups that runs very similar to the river in geography. For example, from west to the east, you can easily recognize that hunter-gatherers are living in the Tobol-Ishim River, and then Irtysh, and Upper Ob, and Upper Yenisei river regions. In our recent study, we studied the early Neolithic individuals from eastern Kazakhstan, it's a site called Koken, and these groups showed a very similar genetic profile with the other Irtysh River populations, although they are north-south-wise geographically quite distant. So that corroborating the idea of riverine geograph's role in forming the hunter-gatherer genetic profile. When the Afanasyevo herders first came into this region about 5,000 years ago, they showed up in north of the Sayan Mountains, north of Sayan Mountains, with this orange rectangles, and they have a very distinct and also very Western genetic profile, as you can see in the map. And we found some individuals in central Mongolia or northern Zungaria from the Afanasyevo culture, mortuary context, and also having the same genetic profile. However, other individuals from central Mongolia or Zungaria with Afanasyevo culture mortuary background shows different genetic profiles, suggesting that they started a rapid mixing with local populations. So when these early Bronze Age herders' genetic profile is compared with the pre-Bronze Age hunter-gatherers' genetic profile, you can easily recognize that those are falling on a space in the PCA map between the Afanasyevo herders and the local substratum, suggesting that they are formed by the mixing of the incoming herder and the local populations. Among those that we know relatively well, and we have studied relatively well of the two groups, which is the early Bronze Age Kamchak or Chamurchak populations in the Altai region, and then Okunebo, also from the early Bronze Age, but from far up in the upper Irtysh regions. Our studies and others shows that these two groups had Afanasyevo ancestry in different proportions and relayed those ancestry to the later populations. Okay, then we can think of the next wave of the Middle Late Bronze Age Shintashta and Andronovo horse herders. And these guys shared a genetic profile commonly called the steppe Middle Late Bronze Age or steppe MLBA. And as you can see, they are largely homogeneous and occupying a larger region across the Kazakh steppe. So the spread of this horse pastoralism in the Kazakh steppe is mostly driven by demic diffusion. Of course, there are some outliers running here. And in our recent study, we showed that these two are actually representing two distinct admixture clines, one actually going up with a much ANE-rich local population, representing an admixture with ANE-rich local populations like Tobor river hunter-gatherers, and the other running straight to the east that represents a group, a source group with much less ANE affinity, so, for example, Upper Obi region hunter-gatherers. What's very interesting is that this rapid demic diffusion really suddenly stopped at the Altai region. In our 2020 studies, we showed that the Mongolian steppe was occupied by the three distinct horse pastoralists during the late Bronze Age. And among those three, only one group, which is very much confined to the western border of Mongolia, had this Andronovo-related ancestry, roughly 50-50 mixture between the Andronovo and the local population, here represented by the DSKC or Deerston-Hurwitz complex populations. Among the remaining two groups that's occupying most of the Mongolia, the DSKC group had a little bit of Western herder ancestry, but in our recent study, we clearly showed that this is from an older Afanasyevo and Kemchak ancestry background, but not from the later Andronovo background. That means that both groups occupying the entire Mongolia obtained horse pastoralism without getting any gene flow from the incoming horse pastoralist populations. And the split between these two groups within Mongolia is also very striking. And in a recent study of ours, we studied the site called Maikhan Tolgoi in central Mongolia, where these two different cultural groups coexisted for 500 years. And even there, the split of these two distinct genetic groups in parallel with the mortuary tradition was just continued there. It's a very interesting thing, and I don't know why. So this segmented nature of the steppe pastoralist populations and also separation between the Kazakh and Mongolian steppe continued to the early Iron Age. In the early Iron Age, you can see that three distinct genetic groups along the Eurasian steppe. And the first one, the slab grave in Mongolia, was genetic and cultural descendants of the late Bronze Age figure burial individuals. In the Altai-Sayan region and eastern Kazakhstan, you can see the so-called eastern Scytho-Siberian genetic profiles associated with the various cultures like Tasmola, Saka, Uyuk, and Pajrik. And then western Scytho-Siberian genetic profiles was found in western Kazakhstan and Pontic-Caspian steppe, and associated with the Sarmatian and Scythian cultures. These two Scytho-Siberian groups were descended from a late Bronze Age mixture between the Andronovo and then the DSKC genetic profiles, but in a different proportion. And then they also get a little bit of gene flow from south, roughly matching to populations living in Central Asia, Iran, or Caucasus. Finally, after this Iron Age, then the Xiongnu Empire rose about 200 years before BC, and the early Xiongnu individual shows a scattered genetic profile running between the eastern Scytho-Siberian and slab grave genetic profiles, suggesting that they just started mixing between these two millennia-old separated gene pools or populations. And then if you look into the late Xiongnu period populations or individuals, then you can see even larger genetic heterogeneity of their profiles, here represented by the wider range of PC1 coordinates in later Xiongnu individuals than the early ones. And in a recent study of ours on the Altai region, then we showed that these types of large amount of diversity is present in a single site, comparable to the entirety of the empire. So the empire was already very well mixing, and very heterogeneous individuals were living in a single society. So thinking of how did they get this larger amount of genetic variation, then this was because they have individuals that cannot be explained by a combination of genetic profiles that was present prior to the Xiongnu in Mongolia. So there were people coming in, and considering their genetic profiles, the likely sources include the steppes further to the west, and also the Inner Mongolia, Ordos, and northern China region, so showing the axis of interactions. Okay, to summarize that, we showed that the pre-Bronze Age hunter-gatherers of this steppe followed this A&E APS genetic line, and also structured by riverine geography. And then the first Afanasev herders left their genetic legacy in Mongolia, first through the early Bronze Age Kemchak culture, and then later the late Bronze Age DSKC cultures. While the large endemic diffusion of Andronovo people largely stopped at the Altai Mountains. And this separated genetic history between Kazakh and the Mongolian steppes continued until the Iron Age, and only when the first empire on the steppe, the Xiongnu, rose, these two millennia-long separated populations started mixing and forming a new groups of population. Okay, with that, I would like to thank CARTA, all of you being here, and my lab members and collaborators. Many of my friends are here. Thank you.